Dr. David Bell, welcome to Grey History.
Thanks very much. Thanks. It's great to be here.
No, thank you. I'm absolutely thrilled to have you here. Recently in the podcast, we have completed a pretty thorough exploration of the war in 1793. We've touched on the military campaign, but also changes to the French war doctrine, the use of conscription and propaganda, the broader embrace of total war. But there's a range of subjects that we haven't discussed: the expanding nature of war aims, the importance of rhetoric in radicalizing the conflict, and of course, we've been focused on the frontiers, but the horrors of total war are seen most controversially in the Civil War in the Vendée. But before we unpack those topics and further explore what you call the First Total War, I think it makes sense to paint a picture of conflicts prior to the Revolutionary Era. You describe 18th century warfare as comparatively limited, aristocratic, in some ways an ordinary part of life. Can you elaborate on the nature of warfare during the 18th century and how it differed from what followed after 1792?
Sure, I'd be happy to. So, one thing which is often misunderstood when I call the Revolutionary Wars the first total war is people assume that I think that everything before the 18th century was mild and moderate, and of course it wasn't. War is never mild and moderate, right? I mean, the wars of the 18th century were hideous, like all war is hideous, and I think we do have to put that out first, just so that there's no misunderstanding. But it also makes sense to try to make comparisons in kinds of war. So if you compare what happened in the 18th century to, for example, what had happened in the 17th century with the great wars of religion, with the 30 Years' War, you see very clearly that the 18th century wars in Europe itself are considerably more moderate. The casualty rates, particularly among civilians, are much lower. The battles tend to be less wild, they're more controlled. There are military doctrines which often state that the goal of a good commander is actually to avoid battles where possible, to really win wars by maneuver, by siege, rather than by in-pitched battles. And you can see that the treatment of civilians, while never good, is better. It's certainly better than it was in the 17th century, better than it would be in the Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars. You can see this, for example, in the Netherlands, which, as always in early modern Europe, the Netherlands was always a theater of war. It's a flat, open, very vulnerable part of the continent. Armies were always marching in. And remarkably, in the 18th century, the civilian population was not always fleeing ahead of these armies. They were often staying and selling things to the invading armies, which gives you a sense that the armies were abiding by a code of conduct, that they were treating the civilian population relatively well. Adam Smith joked in The Wealth of Nations that the Dutch really liked times of warfare because they would get invaded and then they could sell things to the invading armies at much higher prices than they would usually sell their goods. And even if that's an exaggeration, it's still the mere fact that you could tell a story like that and have it at least somewhat believed gives you a sense of what wars were like. Wars were fought constantly in the 18th century. I think most of the major powers were at war for at least 1 year out of three, probably a bit more in the course of the 18th century. And it's important to remember that the European states at the time were still mostly dominated by hereditary aristocracies, and the role of the aristocracy was to fight, was to be a military caste. And when you have a caste which is trained for war, which its purpose is war, this is the second estate, the so-called bellatori in Latin, those who fight. You know, when you have a caste which is trained for this, then obviously these countries are going to fight, and it's going to be considered an ordinary part of existence for these states to test each other, to challenge each other, to take bits of each other's territory. But at the same time, if they're going to be fighting constantly or near constantly, then there had to be limits on war as well. And you can see these very clearly. I mean, 18th century wars were never fought, at least between the major powers, were never fought to destroy the other power or to change the regime of the other power. The French and the British were constantly fighting each other. And unlike in earlier periods and unlike in later periods, there was no assumption that the losing king would be kicked off the throne, that a new government would be put in place. These were wars fought particularly for bits of territory, for honor, for trade. They were fought increasingly for empire, and increasingly they're fought outside of Europe, and there the conflicts could actually be much more bitter and much more serious in terms of the ceding of large amounts of territory. Obviously, Canada is lost to France in 1763. But in Europe itself, again, by comparison with what preceded and by comparison with what followed, the wars were generally considered moderate and limited. Cabinet wars, so to speak, as the phrase was at the time. And while you could still have while the toll of individual battles and the toll on soldiers and even on civilian populations could be dreadful, again, comparatively less dreadful than what preceded, less dreadful than what followed, and again was still considered a fairly ordinary part of human existence, and even an honorable and desirable part of human ordinary existence.
What's clear, as you say, if you look at the age of the religious wars which preceded it, and then the total war of 1792 to 1815, that period in between, is comparatively limited in its size, in its scale, in its aims. And what follows, you use the adjective apocalyptic to describe what follows. And I'm interested, many people, when they hear the phrase total war, the first thing that comes to mind is the 20th century. And so, what we're talking about here is at the end of the 18th century. For you, how do you define total war? And why do you consider its first occurrence to be in the Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars rather than in the wars that might come first to mind to some listeners, such as World War One and Two?
So these are great questions. Just to come back very quickly to the use of the word apocalyptic, which obviously relates to the concept of total war. Mostly in the book, when I use the word apocalyptic, I'm using it to either quote or to translate or to paraphrase the views of people at the time. I do think that compared with what preceded, that these wars had an apocalyptic feel to them. But mostly, I'm trying to talk about the way the wars were perceived at the time as being, and again, something rather quite different from what had preceded. But the question of total war is a tricky one. And one of the challenges that I set for myself when I was writing the book was, is there a way to actually define total war in a way that makes it a useful category of historical analysis? The phrase itself is born in World War One. I mean, Léon Daudet, a French conservative journalist, uses it as the title of a pamphlet in 1918. It's used in German at the end of the war. Then Ludendorff writes his own pamphlet in 1935 called Der Totale Krieg, the Total War. It's popularized particularly in World War II. There's a famous incident when Goebbels addresses a crowd after the defeat at Stalingrad and in Berlin, and he screams to them, "Do you want total war? Wollt ihr den totalen Krieg?" And what's always interesting about these uses in the 20th century is that they're usually not used to describe the war that was actually taking place, but they were actually calls for the war to be more total. So Daudet in 1918 talks about how we have to radicalize the war even further. The Germans, as they are facing defeat in 1918, are saying the same thing. Ludendorff is talking in part about the wars to come. Goebbels in 1943 is saying, "Do you want total war?" with the implication that we don't have it yet. If Stalingrad wasn't total war, I don't know what is in one sense. But this then poses an issue. How do you distinguish total wars from other wars? And you can say, yes, it's the total mobilization of a country's resources to achieve the total destruction of the enemy. But of course, you never actually reach that. That it's kind of an asymptote, if you will, because you can't totally mobilize a country's resources for war. People need to eat. People need to produce energy. People need to do all sorts of things that keep the societies going. At the same time, total destruction of the enemy. What does that mean? Does that mean actually killing everybody? Usually, even in World War II, most countries don't go quite that far, except against vulnerable minorities in the case of the Nazis. Describing a threshold actually becomes rather tricky, and so the idea that I had was I think it is actually can be used as a useful category, but I think the way I tried to define it was actually less as a first of all less as simply a, a material threshold, which you can never really reach, but as a political concept and as the idea that you actually as the attempt to know as the serious attempt to mobilize all of a country's resources for the complete destruction of the enemy. And when you're doing this, also it's then necessarily a radicalizing process as well, where you're each year throwing more and more and more stuff into the conflict in order to achieve that goal, which can never be fully achieved. You never can fully mobilize your resources, but you can try to do it. Now, in that case, it seems to me that total war is fundamentally a modern phenomenon. And it's particularly a modern phenomenon because you could only really have total war of this sort. It only becomes even theoretically possible to mobilize and conceivable and intelligible to mobilize all of the society's resources. First of all, when you actually have the economic ability to feed the country with only a minority of the people actually engaged in producing foodstuffs. And that's something that you get in the 18th century when you have the beginnings of an agricultural revolution. And even in France, by the end of the 18th century, only a minority of the population is now involved in full-time food production and nothing else. And at the same time, you have the rise of government capacity, so that for the first time you have states that can think of it as a kind of project to mobilize all of their resources. So again, you need a kind of revolution in state building, which again you only really have in the early modern period. And you need a conceptual revolution where you can actually think of a state as a single integrated unit, which you can mobilize for the purposes of warfare. To go back to the 17th century, in the 30 Years' War, it was obviously an incredibly dreadful war. The civilian toll was much higher proportionally than what happened in the Napoleonic Wars or in the French Revolutionary Wars. But in the 30 Years' War, you didn't have states that saw themselves as really capable of mobilizing all their resources. All these concepts would have been essentially alien to them. And you didn't have the sense that everybody, that everybody in a state had to be involved in war at the same time. So that, in the 30 Years' War, when, if particular parts of Germany were not involved in the conflict, life was going on pretty much as ordinary, and people were farming and doing what they ordinarily would, and without all that much of a sense even of what might be happening 100 or 200 miles away. And by the time you get to the French Revolution and something like the Levée en Masse of 1793, with this remarkable text that says everybody in the country is going to be working for the war effort. And in one sense, yes, this is, the Levée en Masse has classical models. People think back particularly to the Roman Republic and particularly to the Greek city-states. But these were thinking about very small political units. You could always mobilize a city-state for warfare, as you could at the time of the Peloponnesian Wars. But the idea of mobilizing a large territorial state, of actually being able to survey all the resources, measure all the resources, and actually have sufficient bureaucracy there to gather all the resources and to shift them towards war, that was something which really only happens in the 18th century. And then when you have that, you can also then have the ability for war to radicalize and to bring in steadily more men, more material, more resources every year, and for the stakes of the war to get larger so that eventually you are trying to overturn the enemy regimes and to destroy a large part perhaps of the enemy population. So that's the way I thought that it was actually you could have a useful concept of total war, one that did not simply involve a material threshold of destruction and mobilization, but that actually involved a kind of political process.
No, I agree with the problems that you run into if you're looking at material thresholds. I mean, if you're using every resource available, then how does the concept of total war gel with nuclear weapons in the age of complete destruction of societies? Because so far, no society with the ability to completely wipe the opponent off the map has done that. So you run into these, as you say, these issues when you have material thresholds. But I want to pick up on some of the ideas that you were just talking about there about the kind of factors driving the revolutionaries, in particular in this case, towards total war. You describe a kind of broad and political, cultural context in your book that is helping to drive the revolution towards total war. Before we discuss the consequences of that, I would love to explore maybe a little bit more some of those dynamics that are driving this intensification of
Hmm.
warfare. Is this the revolution's ideology? Is this nationalism? What is driving this fusion of politics and war that ultimately redefines warfare and sees entire societies harnessed for a military purpose?
There's a great deal going on in the French Revolution that drives this forward. Revolutionary ideology is obviously a part of it. The fact that France is now, as of 1792, a republic committed to certain principles of liberty, equality, fraternity, of course, committed to the idea of natural law, committed to a doctrine of human rights, and sets it apart from its neighbors and from its enemies in a very radical way. The fact that the French have now driven abroad a large portion of the elite of the old regime into the emigration, into the counter-revolution, creating a large camp abroad of people, of French people who want to return France to the old regime. Nationalism, of course, also playing a very important role here. The idea that France is a nation which needs to construct itself and needs to oppose other nations. It has its own strong national interests. Already in the wars, you start in 1793-94, you start seeing people talking about, for example, about France's natural frontiers, including the Rhine, which would, of course, therefore assume the annexation of most of the Low Countries and the German Rhineland. You have the fact that the revolution is now sort of applying principles equally across its own territory, which mean, for instance, that revolutionary France is annexing Avignon, which had been a papal territory, that they are stripping German princes of the feudal rights that they previously enjoyed in Alsace, and thereby creating sort of casi belli against these other countries. But there's also something else going on, which goes back to the Enlightenment, and it goes back to this notion that we were just talking about of warfare being considered as an ordinary part of human existence. And one thing which happens in the Enlightenment is that this notion is increasingly challenged. And it's challenged in various ways, so that you have the rise of a kind of Enlightenment pacifism, which is very different from the Christian pacifism that had previously been the principal form of pacifism in Europe, because Christian pacifism was always very irenic and always assumed that in this sinful vale of tears that is the earth, that we can hope for peace, but we're going to have to prepare for war anyway because because people are too sinful to resist going to war. But in the Enlightenment, you start having these notions that, well, we're in a century of progress. We are in a century of enlightenment. We are in a century of commerce and polite coexistence, and that increasingly countries will not need to settle their differences by going to war with each other. They can simply have trade wars if they need it, or they can have peaceful negotiation. And so the idea was that as societies become steadily more enlightened, that war will eventually become seen as something of the past. It'll be seen as as a portion of humanity's sort of barbaric childhood. In that case, well, war comes to be seen then as something utterly extraordinary, unusual, hideous. At the same time, you also have within the Enlightenment and also within the reaction to the Enlightenment for example, with Jean-Jacques Rousseau or also with quite a few figures in Germany, the idea that, that maybe war is actually something we should go back to an earlier form of, that maybe our societies not only are going not only growing enlightenment, they're actually growing too enlightened. They're becoming too polite. They're becoming sort of lazy and effeminate. They're becoming corrupt. And that one way of testing society, regenerating society, is by having a good old-fashioned bloodletting and good old-fashioned sort of war in which people are actually fighting against each other, in single combat and testing each other, and that really the mark of a society's strength and vigor is to be able to go to war. And so you also have this idea, which is also coming out of the Enlightenment. But here too, war is not considered as something, ordinary that you do all the time. It's considered something which is, one great big spasm of regeneration. And so in both these cases, the Enlightenment starts generating the notion that, if you're going to go to war, you'd better really go to war to finish it, to have one last great war, one last great conflict that can really cleanse the society and then perhaps bring about, the rule of perpetual peace. When the French Revolution starts to get into conflicts, first, or quarrels with its neighbors, with its enemies about over things like the canceling of feudal rights in Alsace, or over the idea that some French politicians have of actually extending the rights of man throughout Europe. As this happens, people start thinking, well, okay, if we're going to go to war, we can't simply go to war in the old way and have this kind of limited cabinet war where we're going to maybe take a little bit of territory here or sort of win a few battles for national honor there. We really have to go into it full force. It has to be the last war. And already in October 1792, I quoted, General Dumouriez in front of the National Convention in Paris saying, yes, this war is la dernière guerre, the last of all wars, because once we are done with it, we can put an end to war altogether. So this too then creates the sense, okay, if you're going to be fighting it, you really have to fight as a total war. You have to invest every possible resource in it and do everything you can to destroy the enemy to the greatest possible extent.
One of the key features there is a escalation of rhetoric and taking this idea that you need this regeneration through combat, this final victory, this kind of last war, as you say, to pursue what are quite absolutist aims, spreading liberty and equality throughout the entirety of Europe. Historians will debate about how important rhetoric is in the Revolutionary Wars, particularly as the rhetoric gets more and more extreme and we get to some of the more controversial aspects of the Revolutionary Wars, both on the frontiers and in the Vendée. For you, do you think that this escalation of rhetoric, does it really matter? And does it fundamentally change how the war was perceived and waged for contemporaries?
I think the rhetoric certainly mattered an enormous amount because it's not just rhetoric. It's rhetoric which is also translated very quickly into policy, translated into command in the wars. So, for instance, there's certainly rhetoric is what is behind the levée en masse, and it is behind the mass conscription. It starts with rhetoric. It starts with a decree of the levée en masse, but that very quickly translates into the raising of one of the largest armies ever seen on European soil up to this time, with over 700,000 people under arms. It also translates into, the first of all the creation of a new separate army, a kind of volunteer army alongside the old Royal Line Army. This is very much the result of rhetoric, which is to say a political discussion and debate. And then eventually these two armies have to be amalgamated in a fairly complicated procedure to create the new Revolutionary Army. Rhetoric influences what happens when these armies actually go over the frontier. How are they going to treat the populations that they are invading? Well, in some cases, these areas will be annexed to France. In some cases, the French armies will find local Jacobins who they'll put in power, as they do in Mainz in Germany in 1793, in 1792, 93. So the rhetoric, of course, it matters. It's important to recognize that the rhetoric doesn't automatically translate into policy. Policy and the actual conduct of the wars is still very much limited by material factors. So the French can say in 1793, yes, we're going to bring every able-bodied male into the army. They don't have the capacity to bring every able-bodied male into the army. They don't have the bureaucratic capacity. They don't have the supply capacity. So what happens with the levée en masse, of course, is that you have all these people who are called up, and they don't have weapons. They don't have uniforms, and it takes time to do that. And so there are these people are saying, well, maybe we should just give them pikes, which is really a very bad idea. Also, what happens is that, in the revolutionary armies, particularly in the volunteer armies, there's a period when officers are elected. This turns out to be a very bad idea. Very quickly, the French realize that if they're going to fight the wars and actually win, that they need to develop, new tactics that will make the best use of these masses of very poorly trained men that they've drafted. They need to find ways of producing more materiel, and they need to actually promote professional soldiers as officers. And so already by 1794, you start seeing a real shift whereby, large numbers of former sergeants are being promoted out of the ranks, but they actually know how to do things. They can be officers. You start seeing more of a readiness to trust certain officers of the old regime because they actually know, they actually know how to fight a battle. So there's always so the rhetoric. You can't simply look at the rhetoric by itself, of course, but the rhetoric does have an effect. Yes.
Another aspect around rhetoric is the kind of exterminationist rhetoric that you get directed towards enemies when you're talking about essentially a holy war, and that your foes are not just your foes, but they are enemies of the human
Mm-hmm.
race. They are more than barbarians, they're monsters. How does that impact total war in the sense of willing to use even more aggressive means or pursue even more absolutist war aims?
So to answer that question, let me give you a comparison between two different aspects of what happened in France and its wars in 1793-94. So in the spring of 1794, Bertrand Barrère gets up at the convention and says, we're fighting a war of extermination against England. England must be exterminated. He says England, not Britain. And so we're going to declare that we will give no quarter to British or Hanoverian prisoners. So we will not take British or Hanoverian prisoners. We'll simply shoot them if they surrender. And this order is completely ignored in the field, or almost completely ignored, because the people who would have to carry it out are French officers who recognize perfectly well that if they start shoot that that it will be very difficult to even get their soldiers to execute British soldiers. and that if they do this, the British will simply start executing their own people, and that this is a very bad idea all around. So they don't do it. So there's exterminatory rhetoric which doesn't get translated into actual policy. But then there's the Vendée. And in the Vendée, the exterminatory rhetoric does get translated into very real and very hideous consequences. So the Vendée, of course, scares the bejesus out of the ruling revolutionary circles, because there are several moments at which the revolt in the Vendée does threaten to really explode and to even threaten the revolutionaries' control on the country, even control of Paris. So already as of March of 1793, they are passing the measures about outlaws, saying that people who are found in arms against the Republic will be treated as outlaws and can be simply summarily executed. And so already there are legislative measures being passed that are exterminatory in their at least in their intent. And in the convention, every day, orators are getting up and saying we must exterminate the Vendée. The War of the Vendée goes on. The worst defeats, the Vendean forces are pretty badly defeated outside of Nantes in June of 1793. Then again in July, they're beaten back. By October, there's the defeat at Cholet when they're eliminated really as a major military force. Then there's this sort of pathetic flight of the Vendéans, the Géry de la Galerne, as it's called in French. But what then happens is that as the Bleu, as the revolutionary forces, manage to retake control of the territory, then they actually decide to put the exterminatory rhetoric into practice. So they form these colonnes infernales, these so-called hell columns or infernal columns, which crisscross the territory in early 1794, basically slaughtering left and right, completely out of control. And you can compare what happens there, for example, to earlier episodes of revolt in France under the old regime, because there are plenty of peasant revolts under the old regime that in many ways that have a lot of things in common with the Vendée. And generally, the peasant revolts would be suppressed eventually by the Royal Army. And generally, what the Royal Army would do is they'd kill a lot of people in suppressing the revolt. Then they would take the leaders and they would hang them or execute them in other gruesome fashions. But then generally they would stop with pretty much emblematic executions. They wouldn't try to slaughter the entire population of the region, and they would often actually quietly go back and give the peasants some concessions, so that they would stop future revolts. And even in some of the more bloody episodes, such as the War of the Camisards, which is also a religious war in the early 18th century, or to take a British example, the scouring of the Highlands in Scotland after the Battle of Culloden in 17 after the revolt of the 45, even there, the actual death toll is quite low, both absolutely, comparatively, and proportionally compared to the Vendée, where the death toll is probably about 200,000, somewhere within that range. And this is really a consequence, I think, of total war, of the fact that France is now that the revolutionary leadership considers itself in a war for its survival, and that when they have a population at their mercy, which they don't really have in the foreign wars, because when they're taking British prisoners, they know that the British can execute their own prisoners, so they're not going to do it. But in the Vendée, where they have this population particularly after December 1793, completely at their mercy, they are going to go through and they're just going to kill, 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 and that's what they do.
You describe the Vendée as, I think you said, describe it as the face of total war, as the kind of zenith of total war in the revolutionary era. But there are some historians, a minority of historians, that go much further than that and describe what happens in this region as a form of French genocide. Now, you drew comparison just then to peasant revolts that occurred quite regularly under the old regime. I'm curious, what do you make of these debates that are proposed by a minority of French scholars on the issue of whether the war crimes that occur in the Vendée constitute a genocide?
Well, this is a really tricky issue, and the word genocide is often used. I think the concept of genocide is actually a sort of deplorably slippery one. If you look at the United Nations definition of genocide, it simply talks about the intent to exterminate an entire population. And of course, that can be read in all sorts of different ways. I think myself that, it is such an extraordinarily extreme category that it has to be reserved for not simply in places where there's any intention to exterminate an entire population, but where there's actually where this comes frighteningly close to actually happening. such as, of course, in the genocide of the Jews and the Roma in World War II, or the German genocide of the Herero and Nama peoples in Southwest Africa in the early 20th century, or in Armenia in World War I at the hands of the Ottoman authorities there. I think that if you are going to accept this much more restrictive definition of genocide, the Vendée is very hard to call a genocide because there was no attempt to define the population of the Vendée as a distinct people. Yes, they would say we are exterminating the region, but the region would be defined as counter-revolution. And people from the Vendée who had left the region were not targeted in any way. And people in the Vendée who were very clearly on the side of the revolution were not targeted. People in the Vendée who were still there, and it was not clear where it was often assumed that if they had stayed there, they were on the side of the revolt, and therefore they could be exterminated. But it is a political category. And I think we should also be honest about the motivations of the right-wing historians who use the concept of the Vendée use the concept of genocide and apply it to the Vendée. The word was first used by Reynald Secher in his book of 1986 called Le Génocide franco-français, la Vendée vengée. Secher was a man from the extreme right. He was writing this book at precisely the moment, and it is no coincidence, precisely the moment when the French were beginning to confront in an honest way the role of the French state under Vichy and the role of the French population in actually actively aiding the Germans in the Holocaust and the Shoah of the Second World War. And it was precisely at this moment that Secher and many people on the right, really started using the word genocide in part so that they could say, look, if there's a genocide in French history, which the French are guilty of, it's not the genocide of the Jews in World War II. It is actually the genocide of the Vendéans by the revolution and by the left, therefore, in 1793-94. And now this has developed into quite a cottage industry in the United States. You can see videos that circulate among ultra-right Catholic circles, which say this wasn't simply an attempt to commit genocide against the Vendée, it was an attempt to commit genocide against Catholics, which takes it obviously one very, very large step further, given that 99% of the French population at the time was Catholic. What were they going to do? Kill themselves entirely? So I do think that the use of the concept of genocide here is misguided and has a fairly sinister motivation behind it as well.
Yes, after this, we'll finish our series on the foreign war and be returning to the Vendée and wrapping up not only the military conflict, but also the debates around the hell columns and the mass drownings and the like. So I don't want to say too much just to, prejudice those episodes, but thank you very much for that very thorough answer. And I think listeners, often in the show, when I'm quoting historians from different perspectives, it seems so long ago, but I think there, Dr. Bell just gave a great answer about how these debates can be quite live and timely amongst historians in our own times. I want to kind of pivot towards the end of the Republican era and talk about Napoleon, because there's a lot of Napoleon fans that listen to the show, and you describe Napoleon as a product, a master, and a victim of total war. And at the moment, we're focused on late 1793, so I don't necessarily want to focus too much on 1815 and Napoleon's downfall. But I was wondering if you have any thoughts about how total war helped to enable the rise of Napoleon in the 1790s.
Napoleon would not have been conceivable without total war. First of all, in 1792, when the wars start, he's still a minor artillery officer who has actually been taking a lot of time off from the army to go back to Corsica, where he's been plunging into politics there. And in fact, of course, those of you who know Napoleon's biography know that up until 1793, his great ambition was to actually lead a movement for Corsican independence. So far from wanting to fight for France, he wanted to fight against France. And even though he was an officer in the French army, these paradoxes were quite typical of old regime Europe. And then in 1793, when he's back in Corsica, he and his family lose out in the faction fights with Pasquale Paoli, the great hero of Corsica at the time. And so the Bonapartes have to flee to the mainland. And at that point, Napoleon basically hitches himself to the French Revolution. And then he's very lucky, of course, because this is a moment when the top of the officer corps has emigrated or has been, in many cases, even executed by this point or is getting executed. A huge number of opportunities are opening up for ambitious and talented young officers, particularly those who can show themselves doing a good job of things, as he does, of course, at the Siege of Toulon. So he's very quickly promoted very, very fast to general rank. And then, of course, in 1795, he's given control of the Army of Italy, which is seen as really the least important of the three armies that are going to be engaged in new offensive against the Allies. But he's, of course, able to do remarkable things with the Army of Italy and to do something which centuries of French monarchs had not managed to do and really conquer northern Italy and subdue and really exert French influence over the entire Italian peninsula. And he's able to do this because the wars are so much more rapid, so much more ambitious, so much more free flowing. He's able to really, strip the civilian population in Italy of resources in a way that his predecessors wouldn't have dared to do in the era of more limited war in the 18th century. He's able to carry out reprisals against revolts in Italy in a way that and in a savage manner that owes something to the example of the Vendée, and that his predecessors probably wouldn't have dared to do. And he is able to really command very, very large numbers of men, again, taking advantage of the levée en masse. And he is also ready, of course, now not simply to invade these territories, but actually to establish new governments in them. So he's establishing these new sister republics, or helping to establish these new sister republics throughout Italy, the Cisalpine Republic, the Cispadan Republic, and so on and so forth, quite a few of them in Italy. So in all of these ways, he is able to establish himself as a quite remarkable figure. Then, of course, the other side of the coin is that, particularly after 1795, the French armies are operating outside of France to a greater and greater extent. They are able to essentially behave as kind of independent proconsuls there. They're able to establish these enormous reputations in France itself. So much of the French Revolution by this point, because it is under conditions of total war, so much of the French Revolution is now basically reduced to the war. Particularly after the Terror, after the fall of Robespierre, there is a recognition of the limits on reform and of radical political change within France itself. So increasingly, the revolution is identified with the efforts to expand the country, to bring victory abroad. As it was often said at the time, the revolution has fled into the military camps. And so increasingly, the generals have an increasingly high profile, political profile, and nobody has a higher political profile than Bonaparte. While there are certainly a lot of generals who are making extraordinary careers for themselves in this period, Napoleon is by far the most successful of these. He is also the best by far at using propaganda to promote his own image back in France through newspapers, through artwork, through all sorts of things, through his bulletins. And so in all these ways, already by 1797, Napoleon is seen as a possible future leader of France. He is definitely seen as one of the most important, French figures, full stop.
No, it's fascinating. There's so many great figures in the Republican era that you would go, oh, the revolution made their career possible. I mean, Lazare Carnot, as another military officer, is a great example of, here is a man who is the organizer of victory, but the monarchy wasn't interested in this commoner. There was only so far he would be able to rise in the ranks, particularly with someone which had quite reformist and unorthodox views on certain things. And the list, that applies to amongst military men and amongst, I suppose, civil figures more broadly is humongous.
Mhm.
But Napoleon tops the charts in terms of people that are willing to use that or able to use that successfully to their advantage. I have one last question for you before we wrap up, and it's a detour from Total War, but we're currently in late 1793 in the show, as alluded to before. We love tricky and complicated questions here at Grey History, particularly as it relates to current debates that are occurring amongst historians. We are exploring the terror in the main narrative, and one of the many debates that we'll examine in greater depth in the future is whether the terror, truly existed. And as you know, an increasing number of well-respected scholars argue against viewing the terror as a discrete and coherent historical phenomenon. We've started to wade into this debate in the podcast a little bit, and we still have a long way to go. But I was wondering what your thoughts are on the merits of conceptualizing the terror as something that is a distinct and coherent event.
Well, sure. I mean, these debates have been really interesting, carried out by really talented historians. And I do think that the idea that there was no real terror or that there was no such thing as a terror has gone way too far. I think there was definitely a terror. I mean, it's been argued that that the violence and the repressive measures didn't amount to a systematic campaign of repression, that they weren't bounded chronologically between some point in 1793 and the fall of Robespierre in 1794, that they didn't represent a radical break with the old regime, that they weren't all that different from what other revolutionary countries were doing at the time, that they could be seen, and then Jean-Clément Martin has made this argument as really as the efforts of a very weak government staffed by people who were themselves in the grip of terror to exercise authority over a very fractious set of sort of competing revolutionary actors, particularly in the Sans-Culottes and the Commune of Paris. It's been pointed out that the phrase "la terreur" or "système de terreur" only appeared in political language after the fall of Robespierre, and that really the terror was really only conceptualized as a thing after Robespierre had fallen, in part to put all the blame for what had happened on his shoulders. Jean-Clément Martin sort of showed a few years ago that the convention never actually formally made the terror the order of the day. And it's also been said that, well, the word terror itself had largely positive connotations. Michel Biart summed this up in an article he wrote a few years ago where he said we can't really consider the terror as a chronological period or as a policy or as a system. The Thermidorians led us to believe it was for 200 years, and that was a great propaganda victory for them. But this is not right. And again, I think this is an exaggeration. I mean, no period of great repression and killing is ever wholly systematic or planned out. The Soviet Great Terror of 1937-38 was not, wholly planned out. People have said, I mean, my friend and colleague Carla Hesse has said, well, the American Revolution was also very violent. And well, yes, it was if you say that, if you take sort of military deaths into consideration. If you don't take military deaths into consideration, it's not actually very comparable. The number of people executed in the American Revolution for treason was negligible. I think in the state of Pennsylvania, there were 3 people executed for treason during the course of the American Revolution. Most of the other colonies were fewer. That's compared with, close to 40,000 people executed as counter-revolutionaries in the French Revolution. That terror was considered a sort of salutary phenomenon, that there was nothing unusual about talking about terror is also quite wrong. I think most of the people who use the word terror in the revolutionary context, we actually used it the way we use it today already. They said terror is a terrible thing. And when Robespierre was using it and saying the terror was an emanation of virtue, he was deliberately trying to shock his audience. There's no question. When the Sans-Culottes were saying terror must be made the order of the day, they were trying to shock people. The idea, the terror was considered something that would paralyze people. And that's exactly what the Jacobins and what the Sans-Culottes wanted to do. They wanted to paralyze people. They wanted to paralyze their enemies. These were people who they didn't really believe in representative government, not in this period. They felt that representative government was always prone to corruption. They believed in Rousseau when he said that representative government is a form of slavery. They believed in revolutionary government. Maybe at some point in the future you could have some sort of constitutional government, but right now you needed revolutionary government that wasn't going to be really a representative government. They believed that the people in the street had a kind of role of oversight over the representatives who were always prone again to corruption. And they believed that you needed to use terror as part of this. You needed to use terror to paralyze the enemies of the revolution. You needed terror to get rid of the enemies of the revolution, ideally paralyze them. But in order to paralyze them, the threat had to have real meaning, and you could only have the threat have real meaning if you came through with it on quite a few occasions and actually killed a lot of people. Yes, it's true that the terror built on legislation that had been passed much earlier. The first martial law decree of the revolution is in 1789, but it's not applied in a bloody way until 1793, and under conditions of war, of course. So even if there were precedents, and there are always precedents, and certainly, again, the old regime was a violent regime, but again, as I said a few moments ago, the old regime tended to practice a kind of emblematic violence where you kill the ringleaders and you make quiet concessions. What happens in the Vendée, again, is certainly very different, and what happens in the terror is very different. Yes, the terror was applied very unevenly across the territory of France. And again, I would say, well, of course, I mean, very few phenomena like this are ever applied completely equally. There were parts of the Soviet Union that escaped the Great Terror of Stalin. You were much more likely to be killed if you were in Moscow than if you were in Irkutsk. So does that mean that there wasn't a systematic, terror? Of course not. I mean, there was a great terror in Russia, and there was a terror in revolutionary France. And so I think this deconstruction of the terror, or what Jeremy Popkin calls sort of the don't say terror school, is done. It's the result of a lot of careful research. It's the application of a lot of careful analytical consequences, but the conclusions that are being drawn from it are wrong. I think simply wrong.
Well, thank you very much, David Bell, for your time today. I know my listeners will have loved that thorough exploration of not only the terror, but also the First Total War. If individuals would like to read more about your work or your recent research, where's the best place for them to find that in addition to the links I'll put in the show notes?
Well, I have a pretty comprehensive list of my publications on my website, which is davidavrombell.com. And if that's too long to spell out here, you can go to my page on the Princeton History Department website, and there's a link to my own website, and it gives links to all my books, to recent articles, and to other things and to some research materials and things that I've been up to. So I think that's the best way.
Well, thank you very much for your time today, Dr. David Bell, and thank you for coming on Grey
Well,
History.
thank you very much. It's been a pleasure to be here.